H.A.C.K. Chapter 601, Throwing Dirt on Li Yunmu. Blade Master, because you're an old powerhouse of Earth, I respect you. While saying that, Li Yunmu looked indifferently at the group of fluxers restricting Little Qing, and killing intent suddenly exploded from him. With a single glance from him, the group of battle sages and domain sages didn't try to act tough, and one after another loosened their restrictions on Little Qing. Upon recovering her freedom, Little Qing transformed into a cyan light and rushed toward Li Yunmu without the slightest hesitation. Her 30-meter-long body continuously shrank and gradually twisted into another shape. Clang! A sharp and melodious blade sound could be heard, and a cyan divine blade formed completely. It was the first time it happened on Earth. Comparing physical strength with battle god and blade techniques with Blade Master? What sort of arrogance was this? But at that moment, no one dared to say even half a word to Li Yunmu. After all, his combat strength was above all the supreme transcending experts of Earth. Blade Master anxiously glanced at the other battlefield, but Dennis and his 11 battle angels had firmly locked Battle Sage Vega and Battle Anjing in battle. If they didn't possess valiant combat prowess and strength surpassing that of the battle angels, they probably would have lost their lives long ago. After taking a look at the helpless battle sages and domain sages as well, Blade Master sighed faintly. Although the battle was really influential, not many people participated in it. Only the 3 supreme transcending experts and Li Yunmu were fighting hand to hand. The battle angels and Zhang Xianhu had showed up as well, but that was it. The battles between top experts were always like this, just like when they launched an expedition against God Undercurrent. At that time, the enemy hadn't cared about the losses. As long as he could firmly restrain the 6 supreme transcending experts, he was as good as invincible. Regardless of how enormous their influence or how terrifying their wealth, as long as any ancient clan's top experts perished and the future generations weren't able to reach their heights, that clan would quickly decline. After all, any power's foundation was its top experts. Li Yunmu made a group of more than 20 battle sages to retreat with a roar. As for other low-level existences, any of them who came forward were killed. Therefore, in a battle between 2 powers, as long as one side's top experts were victorious, everything would be settled. War God Shrine was already finished, so next it was time for Bloodwood. You want battle? I will grant you your wish. Blade Master shook his head slightly, and with a single thought from him, the black blade controlling Zhang Xianhu withdrew and changed into a blade made of ordinary material. The next second, flashy blade runes appeared one after another on Blade Master's skin, and his presence began to rise quickly. The instant battle god left the battlefield and Li Yunmu clearly displayed his divine power, there was no longer anyone who was optimistic about the chances of the 3 transcending powers. Even if Blade Master and Battle Sage Vega had other trump cards in their hands, it was unlikely that they would change anything. Regardless of how many trump cards they had, so what? If Li Yunmu, who cultivated divine power, advanced toward them without caring for consequences, how likely would they be to win? With all said and done, Li Yunmu was at a different level compared to the so-called supreme transcending experts. Even if his cultivation wasn't at the very top, he could still crush the battle sages of Earth. Li Yunmu lifted the cyan blade in his hand and gloomily said, "If you all hadn't found trouble with me, I wouldn't have found trouble with you either. Unfortunately, you were more greedy than I had imagined." Blade Master, whose blade runes were emitting bright light, spoke coldly as well. "The winner takes it all. Li Yunmu, the difference between you and me isn't that great. If you aren't greedy, then do you dare publicly reveal the method to reach Deity Realm?" The instant Blade Master's words were spoken, all the pairs of eyes on the battlefield fell on Li Yunmu. Originally, they were frightened by Li Yunmu's power and didn't dare to covet after his knowledge. After all, even when 3 transcending powers joined hands, they were stopped outside Lucky Wind City, unable to advance forward. But Blade Master's words moved the hearts of most of the battle sages. Although they occupied the top ranks of the 55th Earth, but given the present situation, they could not control themselves. Among the experts in the limelight, almost all of them were from the parallel planes. 12 humanoid figures with bat wings were restraining Battle Sage Vega and Battle Sage Jing, and there was also the unheard of Zhang Xianhu who had forced Blade Master into a sorry state. If even the supreme transcending experts who sat at the top were tempted this much, what could be said about the ordinary battle and domain sages? Even if they followed their cultivation path to the end, they would only obtain a supreme transcending expert's combat prowess and nothing more. When stunning experts from all sides came out of their hidden cultivation, what would these so-called supreme transcending experts be worth? One after another, burning hot gazes fell upon Li Yunmu. With his keen senses, he was being pricked by needles. This sort of sensation made him extremely uncomfortable. Li Yunmu turned his gaze onto each of the people below. Yet the battle and domain sages lowered their heads. None of them dared to meet eyes with Li Yunmu, let alone open their mouth and say what they were thinking. After Li Yunmu surveyed his surroundings, a hint of pity appeared in his eyes, and he said with a slight smile, "Greed is the original sin. You all need to look at yourselves in the mirror. You want to obtain the method to turn into a deity, but none of you even dare to open your mouth." Li Yunmu then stepped forward. Almost like strolling in a park, he advanced toward Blade Master. "Unfortunately, you won't meet my gaze. As the troops of the so-called transcending powers, you are only sinister dogs. No, in my eyes, you all are even inferior to dogs. The supreme transcending experts wanted something from me, so they at least opened their mouths to talk, but what about you? Do you dare?" Whilst clearly knowing that Blade Master was only inciting people, wanting the battle sages with wavering emotions to firm their hearts and attack together, Li Yunmu still opened his mouth to mock everyone present on the scene. This wasn't the smartest move, but it was the most suitable choice for him. Even if Li Yunmu was more powerful, it would have been impossible for him to slaughter everyone. Blade Master's move to throw mud at Li Yunmu while facing death could be considered as relatively successful. Chapter 602, Blade Master's Blade Intent. Heaven only knew how many hidden battle sages were still present. In case the fact that Li Yunmu knew the method to step into deity realm was spread everywhere, then these existences who had set their sights on the realm above battle sage would instantly treat Li Yunmu like the most wanted criminal. If they were unable to deal with him, they would most likely try to harm his family. Whatever they chose to do though, one thing certain about these people who believed that they held the leading roles in the world was that they were completely unscrupulous. The 55th Earth wasn't suitable for Li Yunmu to cultivate. If he wanted to advance to the next step, he could only return to the origin world. But his parents and sister wouldn't be able to adapt to the terrifying gravity. It was quite likely that the moment they stepped into the origin world, they would instantly be crushed to death. Thus, a difficult choice presented itself in front of Li Yunmu: renounce his family for cultivation or renounce cultivation for family. This sort of choice always put people in an uncomfortable position, but for the time being, Li Yunmu had no thoughts to renounce anything. Therefore, he could only take action and slaughter as many of the people who dared to covet deity realm as he could. However, this would only treat the symptoms and not the root cause. After all, there were less than half of all the subordinates of the three transcending powers gathered to attack him, and there were also battle sages who hadn't received an invitation to join the battle. "You damned wretch!" Li Yunmu's ice-cold gaze examined Blade Master from top to bottom, and a cyan flame slowly covered the edge of the cyan divine blade with a hint of thunder within it. "I will never regret making an enemy out of you. During cultivation, I have always advanced courageously on the path of hegemonic blade, so forcing me to retreat is impossible. I had believed that sword sage who followed the same hegemonic path would also make the same choice, but alas, I was mistaken." Blade Master slowly shook his head. I don't know what he sensed or what apprehensions he had, but he would rather renounce his hegemonic sword intent and refuse our invitation in our face than become enemies with you. After saying this much, Blade Master tightly gripped the hilt of the black blade which had trapped Zhang Xianhu previously and howled. Come, Li Yunmu, let me see how the strength I accumulated over a lifetime compares to the true deity power. At that instant, Li Yunmu sensed the blade intent of Blade Master. It was completely different from Sword Sage's sword intent, which was tyrannical and hegemonic. If one absolutely insisted on a description, then the blade intent congealed by Blade Master was valiant. Although Li Yunmu didn't know what sort of insight Blade Master had gained which allowed him to comprehend this type of blade intent, he could still guess a thing or two. It was no wonder that Blade Master had rarely reinforced his blade intent with battle skills and instead chose to engrave blade runes on his own body. Blade Master's blade could only be first and not second. It was valiant in the sense that it only knew to kill or be killed. It was even more terrifying than Li Yunmu's danger critical extinguisher. With the help of Li Yunmu's vision, the system saw Blade Master's counterattack when he was at death's door. In an instant, its voice exploded in his mind. Warning! Requesting host to immediately evade. This one strike with Blade Master all power isn't something which host's present defense can resist. Unable to resist? When he heard those 3 words, Li Yunmu hesitated slightly, but there wasn't any change in his expression. Although he was surprised at the terrifying power of Blade Master's strike, he could sense that Blade Master's vitality was quickly fading. The system's words were correct in that Blade Master had staked his everything on the strike: flux energy, blood and flesh, cultivation, and even vitality. Battle Sage had been unable to compare with a half-step deity-level existence. However, if Battle Sage had staked his life on the battle, then let alone speak of a half-step deity, even a genuine deity would have to focus all their power to not be obliterated. Ha 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 ha! A free and relieved laughter suddenly came from Li Yunmu's mouth. After a moment, he looked at the blade energy beam which had already covered more than 100 meters and loudly said, "Since you have staked your life and want to experience the difference between our strengths, I will help you." The analysis of the system's large database was always correct. Since it said that Li Yunmu's defense would be unable to take Blade Master's strike, then it would definitely be unable to take it. Only if he used the last instance of perfect defense would he be able to accomplish this. But all of this wasn't important since Li Yunmu didn't plan to just defend. Even if he could take the attack, he didn't want it. Only if he crushed the beam of blade energy with his own power would the enemies be cowed by his might. It would also show something different from before, when he had only focused on defending. System, help me calculate. If I unleashed danger critical strike while willing to sacrifice a few shadows, could I smash this blade energy into pieces? Li Yunmu's eyebrows jumped once, and while dragging the Cyan Divine Blade in a reverse grip, he closed the distance between himself and Blade Master, whose vitality was quickly declining. The system paused for around 10 seconds before unhurriedly replying. 1 shadow can bring you on par, 2 shadows can shatter the blade energy, and with 3 shadows, not only the blade energy will be smashed to pieces, but even Blade Master would die without leaving a corpse behind. The system both observed Li Yunmu and analyzed the data with his blade energy as reference all the time. But when he asked the question, it had surprisingly taken full 10 seconds to respond. It could be clearly seen that after supplying its strength to Li Yunmu, it had greatly weakened. Prepare 2 shadows for me. Whether for good or bad, he is a famous supreme transcending expert. Since he chose to meet his death, let him die as he wishes, Li Yunmu said with a smile that held not joy in it. With the Cyan Divine Blade moving like a blade flower, he advanced toward his enemy. His gaze was fixed on Blade Master's face. It was a done deal that everyone would know that Li Yunmu knew the method to reach deity realm, and they would covet it. That was why if Li Yunmu didn't unleash his power in front of everyone, he would feel extremely vexed. At that moment, Zhang Xianhe crawled out of countless blade images and looked at a nearby Li Yunmu coldly before saying a few words in a cold voice. "He is my prey." His clothes were tattered. Vicious wounds covered his entire body, and blood flowed out from them. It was very difficult to imagine that Zhang Xianhe could endure this type of damage. If Li Yunmu had been in his place, then without the reinforcement from Azure Dragon expert armor, he wouldn't have been able to last as long as Zhang Xianhu. Clearly, this man had grown furious after being trapped in Blade Master's cage. Without even waiting for Li Yunmu's reply, he pounced on the blade energy. Chapter 603, Then Battle It Is. Blade Master had used all her had on his last strike, so there would be no second strike. Zhang Xianhu only grinned in response to the extremely terrifying blade energy. A layer of blood-red light burst forth from his body, and his flesh swelled crazily. Although his previous form could be called tall and sturdy, it wouldn't make people feel indisposed. At best, he would be described as a human-shaped violent bear with a height reaching 1.9 m and muscles filling the entire body from top to bottom. But at that instant, his muscles bulged, and his height quickly increased to close to 3 meters. Moreover, his muscular body gave the feeling that it was about to explode. As an expert who had also went through the bitter and painful physical body cultivation, Li Yunmu could say that even if Zhang Xianhu didn't use any extra power, the strength of each of his punches would still be no less than 1,000 oxen. This is his Chinese background. Li Yunmu slightly creased his slender and sharp eyebrows. He felt quite shocked when he saw Zhang Xianhu's back. What he saw then should have been Zhang Xianhu's normal state, since the terrifying fluctuations had spread to every nook and corner of his body. If he didn't circulate his power, he was probably around equal to Battle Sage's flawless state. Previously, Zhang Xianhu had to have used some secret technique which allowed him to compress his body to 1.9 m height. Yet people could still see his inability to restrain his tyrannical strength inside his body. How could such a terrifying existence be a nobody though? Followers could be found anywhere in the world. They were weak people who knew that they were inferior and thus instinctively obeyed the powerful experts. But whether it was last time when he came to greet Li Yunmu or when he joined the battle, Zhang Xianhu was always alone as if he didn't have any power backing him or any followers. If the number of people like him was high and each of them was such a tyrannical existence, then probably this branch of humanity from its parallel plane was probably not much inferior to the origin world's humans. After revealing his tyrannical body, Zhang Xianhu waved his arms, and red energy rushed toward Blade Master's blade energy which stretched for 800 meters. The two collided before separating right after contact. The red energy couldn't fight back the blade energy beam for even a breath's time and was torn into nothingness by it. Zhang Xianhu wasn't startled but happy. I have to say that given my cultivation, only it could have suppressed me for so long with a single blade, he cried out in surprise. Blade Master's blade energy beam was like a small child waving his wooden blade in Zhang Xianhu's eyes, completely without any destructive power. This made him aware of the identity of the blade for him. Shua! An incomparably cold blade edge suddenly streaked in front of his eyes. A thin line of blood slowly went down Zhang Xianhu's right cheek. However, he didn't pay any attention to the blade energy beam stretching unceasingly, but expressionlessly turned around. I want that blade. Zhang Xianhu looked straight at Li Yunmu when he raised his request. Behind Zhang Xianhu, the blade edge sent by Li Yunmu and the blade energy beam shot by Blade Master collided, creating an enormous vortex. The blade edge began to crazily strangle the blade energy beam to death. Blade Master, who appeared to be dying, used the last of his strength to lift his head and look at the blade edge which was continuously strangling his blade energy beam. His cracked lips struggled slightly to form a bitter smile. This is divine power. He could sense that Li Yunmu's cultivation was higher than his, but in the 55th Earth, an existence higher than Battle Sage had never existed. Therefore, in the absence of a reference, Blade Master was unable to exactly determine the difference between his cultivation and that of Li Yunmu. Almost everyone present on the scene had their attention focused upon the blade energy beam and blade edge constantly fighting against each other. However, there were also a few experts whose minds were distracted by other thoughts, and their attention was focused on Li Yunmu and Zhang Xianhu. They were quite curious. Originally, this matter was completely unrelated to Zhang Xianhu, but he had entered the battle in order to assist Li Yunmu and was even almost killed by Blade Master. Then at that moment, how would Li Yunmu respond to the request raised by Zhang Xianhu? If Li Yunmu's choice of weapon was something else, then he probably would have agreed to this request. But the weapon in which Li Yunmu held expertise was also a blade, and many of his battle skills were also related to it. How could then Li Yunmu renounce such a treasure like the Black Blade? The wound on Zhang Xianhu's face began to heal quickly, and he spoke in a heavy voice once more. I want that blade. Li Yunmu lightly shook his head. I can agree to give anything but that black blade. I have an important reason to get hold of it. His reply startled the majority of people on the scene. They could hardly believe their ears. A powerful expert had staked his life to assist you in battle and in return requested a treasure which you might not even need as a spoil of war, so how could you even consider that excessive? Zhang Xianhu's gaze began to wander over Li Yunmu's body. After a long while, he said with a gloomy face, if I also have a reason for acquiring that blade, then what? War. Li Yunmu's loud and resonant voice echoed without any hesitation. This time, not only the attention of the spectators but even the vampires as well as Battle Sage Vega and Battle Sage Jing was attracted. They all stopped battling simultaneously. Your distinguished self Li Yunmu, our vampire clan. Dennis slightly knitted his brows. He wanted to raise his own request so as to avoid any problems later which might end up in a similar predicament, Li Yunmu not agreeing to allow them to carry away the corpses. Li Yunmu nodded while raising his hand to cut off Dennis. As long as I obtain that black blade, you can distribute the other spoils among yourselves. I still owe you for this matter. After Li Yunmu's words, one after another, many burning gazes focused upon the blade and Blade Master whose vitality was decreasing quickly. Everyone wondered what sort of treasure was the black blade to have attracted the interest of both Li Yunmu and Zhang Xianhu. What sort of mystery did the blade have that two experts who were above the supreme transcending battle sages were about to have a falling out over it? Even Blade Master, who currently possessed the black blade, didn't know about its secret. He only used the blade in the simplest manner and had no clue about its history. Chapter 604, Marquis Huan's Descendant. Zhang Xianhu slightly raised his eyes and indifferently said, Li Yunmu, I have no interest in your favor. I only want that black blade, otherwise, a war between us is unavoidable. Li Yunmu did not show any reaction toward Zhang Xianhu's attitude. There was no free lunch in the world. Just like the vampires, Zhang Xianhu had to have a reason to run over to assist him against the three transcending powers. Vampires wanted the corpses of powerhouses, and Zhang Xianhu wanted the black blade. From the beginning, he knew that it was in Blade Master's hands and that Blade Master had certainly refined it. Therefore, Zhang Xianhu had chosen him as his opponent, so as to have a genuine reason to not get Li Yunmu involved. But he hadn't expected that Blade Master would be ready to renounce his life just to imprison him in the unique blade curtain. This had then given Li Yunmu the chance to interfere. Li Yunmu slightly raised the corners of his mouth and said with a gloomy expression, regardless of whatever your aim is, it doesn't change the fact you assisted me. I will allow you to make the first move. What do you think? The system had an unprecedented thirst toward the black blade. It was the first time it had went as far as to infuse him with its energy. Although Li Yunmu didn't know the reason why Zhang Xianhu had conspired to obtain the blade, he couldn't yield here. Regardless of what use for the black blade Zhang Xianhu and the system had, it was completely unrelated to Li Yunmu. But when the system promised that he could exchange it for great devouring technique, the black blade became directly involved with his interests. The red energy slowly congealed behind Zhang Xianhu. In a few breaths, it took the form of a muscular Chinese man. It had the height close to 8 feet, bare upper body, round eyes, well-formed forehead, and was holding a red viper halberd in his hand. Just a glance at the muscular man's projection made Li Yunmu heart throb loudly as if his guts were about to spill out. What tricks do the Chinese have up their sleeves? Li Yunmu knitted his brows slightly. That bloodline power, this Zhang Xianhu's ancestor definitely isn't an ordinary character, so his people forget it. Right now isn't the time to teach you about these characters. Just think of this power as analogous to a power used by a sage to protect their descendants. It can take the initiative to attack and nothing more. Some vague emotions could be heard in the system's voice, giving the impression that even it was startled by Zhang Xianhu's methods. The rough explanation caused the suspicion in Li Yunmu's heart to grow even stronger. Who were those people? What gigantic secret was the system trying to conceal that even his present strength was not enough to learn about it? After the muscular man's projection appeared behind Zhang Xianhu, his complexion became even paler. After spitting out a breath of impure air, Zhang Xianhu concentrated his gaze on Li Yunmu and said in a heavy voice, "That blade is related to the power of fate of my people. According to what I know, you aren't the successor." Power of fate, successor. Hearing these two strange words from Zhang Xianhu's mouth, Li Yunmu's breathing became ragged. Although Zhang Xianhu hadn't declared his position directly, Li Yunmu could sense that he definitely wasn't going to yield. Suddenly, a stream of numbers appeared in Li Yunmu's right eye. After a moment, the system squeezed a large amount of data into his brain. Shu Han's Marquis Huan Zhangfei's descendant? So this blade should be Xian village's Marquis blade. His flat and dull voice caused Zhang Xianhu's eyebrows to jump. He looked at Li Yunmu in a daze, as if someone else stood in his place. The ancient presence surrounding him was even more terrifying than that of some old ancestor. At that moment, Li Yunmu began to feel like the truth about the world wasn't as he had heard from others. There seemed to be a terrifying truth hidden below the surface of his world. And the system's large database contained countless resources, battle skills, and cultivation methods. Li Yunmu had only scratched the tip of the iceberg. Yes. After the bewilderment at the beginning, Zhang Xianhu nodded firmly. Since you know that the Black Blade is the Xian village's Marquis blade and that I am the descendant of Marquis Huan, then you... Humph. Li Yunmu snorted coldly and said, "You should be clear that since I know your identity yet you still have to ask for the blade, that my decision is not in your favor." Then... Zhang Xianhu's complexion suddenly sank, and the red energy covering his body increased sharply as if to devour Li Yunmu. However, at this time, the projection of the muscular man behind him took action and stretched his hand to grab Zhang Xianhu's shoulder. After a moment, all the red energy dissipated completely. At the same time, the muscular projection cupped its hands toward Li Yunmu, and the vibrations created from the dispersal of the red energy surprisingly caused a voice to echo in the area. This youngster wasn't sensible and offended senior. Shortly after, the muscular man's projection grabbed Zhang Xianhu, and without waiting for the system's reply, it transformed into a scarlet beam that fled into the distance. The terrifying speed at which it fled was that of an ordinary man who had encountered a vicious animal. "Go, take that blade and collect it into your heavenly world." The system's indifferent voice echoed slowly, as if it wasn't an ancient being that had scared the red energy figure just a moment ago but an insignificant ant. After Zhang Xianhu was dragged away by the projection of muscular man, Blade Master, who was on the verge of death, lowered his head and completely submitted. Li Yunmu walked through the air. When passing by Battle Sage Vega and Battle Sage Jing, he didn't even so much as look at them on his way to Blade Master. His hand rose, and a blade sliced down, opening a fountain of blood in Blade Master's neck. Li Yunmu had never shown mercy to his enemies. Even if the Blade Master was weakened to the point that he would die at any second, Li Yunmu had to personally send him to his death. Who knew whether an existence like Blade Master still had some methods to escape? If he succeeded in leaving, he would certainly grow stronger and in the future might come back to take revenge. After killing Blade Master in one strike, Li Yunmu made a grab for the blade, and an enormous suction force came from his hand, pulling the black blade into his hand. The moment Xian village's Marquis blade entered his heavenly world, Li Yunmu discovered that it vanished as if it had been completely absorbed by the system. As for you both. Li Yunmu's gaze fell upon Battle Sage Vega and Battle Sage Jing. Chapter 605, The Price. Li Yunmu expressionlessly looked at Battle Sage Vega and Battle Sage Jing, who had stopped battling. In the two pairs of black and white eyes, there were no fluctuations regarding their mental state. Li Yunmu's feelings were quite complex regarding Battle Sage Vega. If she hadn't taken an interest in him before, he probably would have lost the opportunity to descend to the origin world to search for a method to become a deity. This would have certainly influenced the rate of increase in his strength and his upper limit. Although in the seventh dimension all the supreme transcending experts including Battle Sage Vega had tacitly agreed to use him as bait, Li Yunmu could understand her thought process. She had been faced with the choice between a promising youngster and the future of all humanity. It was a very simple question, and any ordinary person with some intelligence would know what to choose. Therefore, although Li Yunmu felt vexed in his heart, he didn't hold a grudge toward the Battle Sage Vega because of this matter. The reason why he kept the method to reach deity realm in his hands was because he wanted a battle which would illustrate that he stood at the peak of this world and nothing more. But when Battle Sage Vega allied with Battle God and Blade Master to kill Sword Sage and led her troops toward Lucky Wind City, Li Yunmu felt a dull ache deep in his heart. He didn't have a deep connection with Sword Sage, but this supreme transcending expert had still chosen to stand by his side, while Battle Sage Vega and Battle God, who had once thrown an olive branch to him, stood in opposition. When the eyes of Battle Sage Vega and Li Yunmu met, there was no change in her expression, and she didn't open her mouth to give an explanation. Unlike other peak experts of the 55th Earth, Battle Sage Vega wasn't hypocritical. Her attitude was clear, and she calmly confronted everything. The winner was the king, and the loser the bandit. It was like that since the ancient times. Battle Sage Jing, who wore the black twin star supreme battlesuit, however, had a mocking smile. She spoke as if thinking out loud. Such a long time has passed, and the little guy who needed me to act as a battle sage behind him has surprisingly reached this stage today. No wonder she desired to become a deity this much. When she used the word she, her gaze turned to Battle Sage Vega, and the ridicule in her eyes grew stronger. What's the use of saying anything? Battle Sage Vega asked while raising her chin slightly. If I die here, will you remain alive? While she spoke, the human powerhouses who hadn't stepped into the battlefield began to channel their flux energy. They were prepared to enter the battlefield at any time and give up their life to ensure that Battle Sage Vega could retreat safely. Of the 6 supreme transcending experts, Sword Sage and Blade Master had already perished. Battle God's whereabouts were also unknown, which meant that the heavens had changed. The earth could not support the loss of so many peak experts. Don't be nervous, I don't have any plans to deal with you for the time being. I'm here today only thanks to Battle Sage Vega's favor back then. With his both hands clasped behind his back, Li Yunmu raised his chin and looked at Battle Sage Vega. Vu. After hearing his words, Battle Sage Vega heaved a sigh of relief as if a large burden had dropped off her shoulders. The present Li Yunmu could easily be placed above all the supreme transcending experts and might even be able to battle against the 6 of them at once. But unfortunately, they would not have the opportunity to test it. I say, you all chose to begin today's battle, but you can't choose when it ends. Li Yunmu's indifferent gaze caused the hearts of the fluxers of the 3 sides to go cold. Shortly after, he again opened his mouth and said slowly, kill all the Nirvana Flux Masters and those above that belong to Blattywood and War God Shrine. The moment he said that, the 21 shadows which had silently returned to Lucky Wind City led his troops away from the protection of the city to begin a slaughter. In the sky, the vampires, who had opened their bat wings one after another, also rushed into the battlefield. They would take their prey into the sky and drink their blood until they were full. Whoosh! 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 Without any hesitation, the fluxers who were being hunted circulated all the flux energy in their 4 limbs and 100 bones to unleash their maximum speed. The Cyan Divine Blade in Li Yunmu's hand began to distort at that moment. He pulled back his hand, and the Cyan Longbow was pulled taut. One after another, several arrows with red-colored bodies and thunder flickering around them congealed at the bowstring. All the Nirvana stage and above level fluxers of Bloody Wood and War God Shrine halted in their steps when Li Yunmu formed the arrows. Even if his cyan longbow was aimed toward the sky, they could clearly sense that some sort of strange power had locked onto them. An existence whom even supreme transcending experts couldn't resist had locked onto them, so where could ants like them run or hide? Turn around and stake your life on this. Today, whether we flee or not, everyone will die. Yes, turn around and fight. Killing one is breaking even, killing two is profit. Li Yunmu. Your father will wait for you in hell. You will not have a good death. I don't want to die. Save me. I request you all. All sorts of things were said by the group of people upon which Li Yunmu had locked on. Some were cursing him, some were showing ruthlessness, while others were begging for mercy. But all of this had no influence on Li Yunmu. After all, everything in the world had a price. Since those people had decided to stand in opposition to him, they also had to be willing to pay the price. Li Yunmu didn't dare to say that if he was the one on the losing side, that he would show more control than the people before him. But Li Yunmu never chose to do anything above his ability and didn't get himself tied to a chariot of war to confront enemies whom he didn't have the strength to confront. He gradually loosened his grip, and scarlet rays covered the sky while surging thunderbolts deafened everyone. After a short moment, red thunder dragons rushed down and killed a number of sage experts who were still not convinced, in a 7 to 8 kilometer region. In no time, the fluxers coming from Lucky Wind City as well as the vampires with sinister appearance pounced on the people who had turned around to fight. Li Yunmu's side didn't suffer any major losses while slaughtering the despairing enemy fluxers. Battlefield was a carefully chosen stage in which tyrannical strength didn't mean certain victory. Yet the despairing fluxers couldn't even band together to form a formation to effectively attack or defend. Chapter 606, Major Secret about the Past. System, what should be the starting point when I enter the origin world again? With his arms crossed in front of his chest and cold eyes focused on the fighting underneath as well as the stably retreating fluxers of Vega Temple, Li Yunmu spoke to the system. Even now, do you still intend to keep your mouth shut about these matters? Even if I have already guessed some of them. H.A.C.K echoed in Li Yunmu's consciousness, and shortly after, an unheard voice spoke up. All right, then I will ask you a question first. If I said that the so-called Dark Age and the dimensional beasts are an enormous sham, would you believe it? Although Li Yunmu couldn't comprehend how the system had devoured the Xin village Marquis blade, the hiccup left him dumbfounded. It seemed that after he learned that the system wasn't a machine for computing, it started acting more and more like a living being. Once he got over it, he paid attention to its words, and his blood went cold. All thoughts of ridiculing the system disappeared from his mind. Seems like you cannot believe, but it doesn't matter. Since you raised the question, I will tell you so that when the time comes, you will know what sort of enemy you are facing. After saying that, the system slowed down before picking up speed again. Actually, the 55th Earth's plane, which is your homeland, isn't a prison. Don't tell me you weren't curious about the reason why these parallel planes were numbered? And who had numbered them? And what sort of significance they had? The significance of the numbers? Who would number them? Li Yunmu knitted his brows. You mean there's a terrifying organization behind the scene which is controlling everything? What is their aim? Before the Dark Age, the human civilization had developed to the peak, and all sorts of weapons, including nuclear ones, had existed. They had forced the human nations to refrain from war and stop invading other countries. But unfortunately, the resources on the Earth were limited. At the start, the human population was quite small, but it slowly grew in size and crossed the threshold of what each country could support. In time, the production of the majority of resources could not keep up with the speed of human consumption. As the time passed, the humans of different countries focused their gazes on the other countries. Countless small arguments started happening in secret, ranging from only a few people being involved to small-scale battles between several hundred people. Because of this, the population of humanity began to decrease at a substantial rate. In time, many countries lit a true fire from a small spark, and one after another large-scale battles happened all over the world. But this sort of war was meaningless. It only resulted in a futile consumption of resources and population. Still, everyone held on to their destructive weapons, not daring to use them casually. A strange program then spread among the upper echelons of each country: God creation program. The research on super soldiers had been carried out in countless countries, but the results didn't reach the ideal target. Those who could be rated as elite soldiers were still far from being comparable to super soldiers. Only when a soldier could endure the blow of a guided missile or even a nuclear warhead could they be called a super soldier. But this sort of power seemed to only exist in legends. Thus, the upper echelons of each country began to secretly replicate and adjust the gene samples of its best people. The projection of the muscular Chinese man which Li Yunmu had seen was precisely one of the characters created by such a program. Initially, these soldiers created from mutated genes brought a pleasant surprise to the ambitious people. In order to observe the different strength of soldiers with different genes, they established a grading system, which still continued in the origin world. But these genetic soldiers had a common characteristic that their strength would be fixed from the time they were created. The majority of them were like the ancient gods of present who found it very difficult to advance. After they were created, however, the ambitiousness of humanity enraged some sort of undeifiable will. The space was torn apart by some indescribable power, and dimensional beasts descended on Earth. They almost destroyed the entire human civilization in one day. The ambitious humans sensed the existence of other spaces and dispatched numerous human-created gods to explore. Afterwards, they found 66 dimensional spaces in which humanity could exist, namely the 66 projection planes. The human-created gods spent a lot of time and resources to make the 66 dimensional planes similar to Earth. The humans with the highest aptitude at that time then entered those dimensional spaces. This was the reason why when Li Yunmu entered the origin world, he found that the humanity on that side was clearly divided into grades, while everyone on the projection planes were nobles. After all, their ancestors hadn't brought them to the parallel planes to trap them, but to preserve the humanity's hope. But even in the 66-dimensional spaces the humans weren't able to get away from the dimensional beasts. Many of them pursued humans into the dimensional spaces. After that, some ambitious person concealed everything, and thus that time in history slowly came to be known as the Dark Age. Vu. After hearing the system's recount, Li Yunmu spat out a breath of impure air and knitted his forehead with a worried expression. Even if it had been someone else in his place, they wouldn't have been able to easily accept the real truth about their world. But given that those words came from the system's mouth, Li Yunmu had no choice but to accept them. After a while, he threw his head backwards and shook away all thoughts from his mind. Then what about you? What is your aim? The system didn't have any desires? No goals? Li Yunmu wouldn't believe it even if he was beaten to death. The system absorbed data, but the strength it possessed was real and could even shatter the barrier temporarily, allowing Li Yunmu's cultivation to rise to half-step deity realm. Moreover, it certainly wasn't the system's full strength, otherwise, it would not have went dormant. At the moment, a single strike that could obliterate an ancient god was the system's extreme limit. But after seeing the reaction of the projection of the muscular Chinese, it was obvious that the system in its peak state was definitely not an existence which human-created gods could dare to offend. It was an existence possessing a large database and countless inheritances from before the Dark Age, yet hiding within Li Yunmu's body and crazily accumulating power. If someone that such a being didn't have a goal, then even if he was beaten to death, Li Yunmu would not believe it. The system hiccuped again before saying in a cold voice, "For now, you are not qualified to know." Chapter 607, Sense of Urgency. After 3 days, Li Yunmu addressed his shadows in Lucky Wind City. Li Tian, Li Dai, Li Feng, Li Yun. He crossed his arms over his chest, and his black and white eyes surveyed the shadow troops. In a profound tone, he then said, "You four will remain on Earth and maintain the peace and security of Lucky Wind City in my place. My family's safety will also be in your hands. Be relieved, Master. We will take care of everything." The four cupped their fists as one, expressing their resolve to follow his commands. The four shadows were the earliest shadows congealed by Li Yunmu, and their intelligence had grown to be little different from that of ordinary people. Yet because of encountering different circumstances, they all possessed what could be classified as their own characteristics. In short, it could be said that whether in terms of intelligence or strength, the four shadows weren't much inferior to Li Yunmu. The most crucial factor was that since they were Li Yunmu's shadows, it didn't matter how they changed, for they would always remain absolutely loyal to him. Li Yunmu slightly nodded and raised his eyes to look at the roof. Instantly, a guided heavenly bridge descended, and Li Yunmu ascended it with his 17 shadows. Gradually, their presence completely disappeared from Earth. Name: Great Devouring Technique. Category: Cultivation Method. Grade: Properties: Absolute Devour. Absolute Devour: air, energy, living beings, and even the ethereal fate can be devoured. Almost every energy which could be sensed by the successor of Great Devouring Technique can be devoured and transformed into his own energy. As the grade of Great Devouring Technique rises, the ratio of the change will also grow higher. Exchange Requirement: requires the system to reach level 10. This was the latest information released by the system, and it could be considered as both good news and bad news. The good news was that the system finally complied with its promise and gave Li Yunmu the chance to acquire the Great Devouring Technique. It was no longer like before when it had tied up this cultivation method, which Li Yunmu yearned for in his dreams, in a bundle and put on a high shelf so he could only watch it without any method to acquire it. The bad news was that the requirements to obtain the cultivation method hadn't been listed out by the system. Thus, he only knew that the system needed to attain level 10 and nothing else. Throughout the first 6 grades, the system had only assisted Li Yunmu and helped him comprehend a large number of battle skills. At the 7th grade, it allowed Li Yunmu to forget, merge, and have a breakthrough in the foundation skills which he had comprehended. In short, the level 7 system allowed Li Yunmu to choose the direction in which his strength progressed, so the 8th, 9th, and 10th levels wouldn't only assist Li Yunmu so that he could continue to become more powerful without any plan. Who could say what sort of ability the level 10 system would possess? And what sort of new energy type would appear? If he wanted to upgrade the system to level 10, Li Yunmu would have to return to the origin world, but Underworld Serpent had already snuffed him out. He had returned to his Earth not only to change his status and increase his authority, but for other reasons. The most important one for him was to arrange sufficient protection for his family and relatives, so that others wouldn't get an opportunity to get to them. Although the system hadn't said anything, Li Yunmu had a premonition that this wouldn't be his only journey back to his Earth. Perhaps after the heavenly transformation stabilized and the powers from all sides went through a big shuffle, some unexpected changes might occur. Back in the day, before the flux energy, hadn't the ambitious humans created artificial gods, or in the cultivation civilization, hadn't they also reached great heights? Perhaps the aim of that pack of ambitious wolves who chose to go to the 66-dimensional spaces wasn't as simple as the continuation of humanity. Otherwise, why were the 66-dimensional spaces in harmony with each other? If their experts fought each other to the death, who would profit the most? Who would be the true winner? Each of the parallel planes, which were the projection of the main Earth, had some method to return to the origin world, so could it be that the existence of the origin world wasn't hidden from the people who established humanity in the 66 planes? As the descendant of an artificial god, Zhang Xianhe definitely knew more about it. But he didn't inform Li Yunmu and instead had turned Li Yunmu's focus toward the direction of the prison theory. The artificial gods and the ambitious people from before the Dark Age were the true enemy of Li Yunmu and all the parallel planes. Li Yunmu's complexion suddenly paled while standing on the heavenly bridge. Given that the 66-dimensional spaces had fused together, he could guess the next step of the ambitious people lurking in the darkness once the situation stabilized. Chapter 608, I can remove him. Loading World Template. World Template loaded. Creating Search Template. Search Template created. Beginning search. A series of continuous notifications echoed on a huge display which had a stream of numbers. A middle-aged man wearing a white gown was steadily gazing at the numbers flitting past the screen with his arms crossed in front of his chest. Even if this guy's influence in the past was great, he's still only an experimental product we created. Why would we need to be careful? He mumbled. A pair of blue-colored falcon-like eyes fell on the middle-aged man, and after a while, he coldly snorted. That guy isn't only an experiment. Strictly speaking, he can also be considered to be a civilization crystal. The Master of Blue Eyes slowly opened his mouth. Do you really think that just by relying on the human technology, we could create so many fake gods? After saying that, the blue-eyed master paused. He grinned, revealing his white teeth, and coldly said, our gains from cheating him were great. In the end though, he escaped from us with great difficulty, so who knows what sort of revenge will he exact. The middle-aged man wearing white clothes stretched out his hand and made a gesture toward the screen. A new thin screen appeared where the overview of the whole world could be seen. His chilly gaze flitted across all the still and moving things on the monitor before he said gloomily, where has he escaped to? Everything in the origin world is under our eyes. If he wanted to accumulate power, he could only go to those projection planes, but that side ha ha ha. The white-clothed middle-aged man began to laugh without finishing his sentence. After all, the cultivation path wasn't left intact on any of the 66 projection planes. It was good if the experiment could make a large leap, but if his luck was not good, he might remain submerged in dormancy on one of the projection planes. The blue-eyed master nodded lightly. Regardless of where he went or how much strength he has accumulated, the Earth projection plan should be carried out according to schedule. You all best prepare properly. We don't want to make the people who will fight and capture our targets to wait for long. But Lord King Lan. The middle-aged man in the white gown licked his lips. Some of the ancient gods who had escaped alive have regained consciousness. They're trying to acquire more strength right now, so should they not be treated a threat? That is a problem for those specializing in capture and hunt. Given your aptitude, you only need to follow the plans arranged by us. The blue-eyed master looked expressionlessly at the middle-aged man wearing a large white gown. His chilly eyes made the other man feel as if he had fallen into an ice cave. In the origin world, Li Yunmu expressionlessly surveyed his strange surroundings. From time to time, a series of numbers flitted through his eyes. One helping the swindler and the swindler. Still want to find me? Even if the system didn't possess a material body, Li Yunmu could still sense it shudder at that moment. Otherwise, it wouldn't have lost control and ignored the fact that he might see some secret. Li Yunmu, ha, we finally meet. A hoarse but extremely charming voice echoed in the air and instantly attracted Li Yunmu's attention. A tall and slender figure enveloped in a black gown and wearing a golden mask was standing in the air. The wind raised the man's sleeves, revealing a scene from hell. At that moment, even if Li Yunmu couldn't see hydralisks trying to crawl out of the abyss, he would still be clear about the other party's identity. With the reinforcement of power supplied by the system, he had already the level of the half-step deity. Because of that, he could capture the powerful fluctuations coming from the other party's body. They clued him in on the cultivation of the other party without any need of skin from the system. The golden mask-wearing member of the Underworld Serpent put his hands behind his back and said in a heavy voice, "You don't need to tense up. For the time being, the bounty Underworld Serpent has issued for you is not high enough for M to take action. I have come to discuss collaborating with you." Li Yunmu raised his eyebrows in interest, but his right hand was still tightly pressed against his waist. With this posture, Li Yunmu could unleash his most powerful strike at any moment. It was impossible for him to lower his guard just because of one line from the opponent. I have a method to strip away that existence from your body. The golden-masked Underworld Serpent's member raised his chin slightly. As long as you are willing to give him to our Underworld Serpent, I can find ways for you to lose the bounty on your head and even guarantee that you will advance to Ancient God Realm. You, a half-step deity, wants to guarantee my advancement to Ancient God Realm. A hint of ridicule flashed across Li Yunmu's face. Upon hearing this, the golden-masked Underworld Serpent member shook his head and sighed. Li Yunmu, you greatly underestimate the organization called Underworld Serpent. You have no idea what sort of an existence you're facing against. After saying that, the golden-masked man removed his mask and said with a slight smile, the youngster doesn't know anything, but I think you clearly understand what sort of existence we are fighting against. We are the same, just Underworld Serpents resisting in abyss. We are not enemies. From the time the member of Underworld Serpent had appeared, the system had remained silent as if it didn't exist, and it didn't react to his words now either. Li Yunmu narrowed his eyes and coldly said, regardless of what you say, I will reply to you in his place, H.A.C.K off. His last two words were like a thunderbolt. He had said them in the same manner as when he had forced more than 20 battle sages to retreat with one roar on earth. But this time, his words were like a spring wind. They only blew back the other party's clothes, not even forcing him to retreat half a step. Was this the difference between half-step deity and battle sage? Even with a minor difference in their cultivation, the difference in their strength was like heaven and earth. All right, since you aren't willing, then forget about it. The Underworld Serpent's member didn't seem to care much about forcing him and only calmly said, but I advise you two to flee quickly. I have paid quite a large price to shift you both here, but it won't fool them for long. When Li Yunmu's gaze met with the other party's, he felt his heart go cold. In the depths of those eyes, all the secrets of the world seemed to be hidden. Regardless of what happened, it would not be able to escape them. Chapter 609, Sleipnir. Neigh. The neighing of a horse, which was as loud as a large bell and could shake people, echoed from the distance. After a short moment, a small black dot appeared in Li Yunmu's vision. As time passed by, it gradually became larger. With Li Yunmu's eyesight, he could soon see the main body of that black dot. It was an 8-legged warhorse with a completely white mane. Sleipnir? What ghost is that? Li Yunmu read through the information supplied by the system with bewilderment on his face. An ancient god-level 8-legged warhorse, what sort of existence was that? Sea beasts from the abyss of the deep sea which hadn't been explored by humans, or did it come from the parts of the world which humans didn't have the strength to explore? The master of such a warhorse, what sort of existence would it be? An existence at a level higher than ancient god? Ding! Red alert! A large amount of ancient god level power has been detected in the vicinity. Requesting host to escape quickly. After hearing the system's alert, Li Yunmu turned around to look at the golden-masked member of Underworld Serpent. Upon seeing him, the bewilderment on Li Yunmu's face immediately changed to "Are you kidding me?" expression. With the half-step deity nearby, how could they escape? The golden-masked member of Underworld Serpent helplessly shrugged his shoulders and muttered, I allowed you to escape, so you have brought this upon yourself. I have no way to help you. Once he said that, a strange ripple suddenly spread out from the body of the golden-masked man, and the next instant, he disappeared. Mount, the system said in an indifferent voice in Li Yunmu's mind. Are you joking? Li Yunmu was dumbstruck while looking at the 8-feet-tall warhorse. He timidly inquired, This is on our side. Don't speak nonsense. I can't control it for long. If you want to die, do it alone. Don't bring me down with you. The system's temperament had clearly become much more irritable compared to before. From the time they had re-entered the origin world, it had been angry. It was especially evident when it had sensed a large amount of ancient god-level power in the vicinity. It had made it lose control. Li Yunmu couldn't even begin to imagine what sort of rage could have caused the system to lose all reason. Without enough time to think, he quickly mounted Sleipnir. The next instant, the war horse's 8 legs instantly took off. Li Yunmu felt the scenery pass through his eyes at flying speed. Before he could realize what happened, they had already reached Whale Island. "Youngster, are you still not gonna come down?" a voice full of killing intent demanded. Right after, the warhorse shook its body, and Li Yunmu came crashing down on the ground. Vu! The system heaved a sigh of relief in Li Yunmu's mind and said in a cold voice, "Those people are only so-so. Even after so many years, they didn't make even a little progress. Seems like they still haven't broken the genetic code which I left behind at that time." Sleipnir focused its gaze on Li Yunmu for a moment, then a complicated emotion passed through the 2 eyes which seemed to contain multitudes of stars. After a while, the Sleipnir kneeled on its 8 feet and said in a profound tone, "Sleipnir thanks Lord for freeing him from their control. If Sire could, I hope that your distinguished self would remove the control restriction on my master too." "Odin? Didn't that guy proclaim himself as the wise god? Yet he can't even free himself." The system sneer came through Li Yunmu's mouth. Back in the day when all the human countries were secretly conducting the god creation program in secret, almost all of them had reached a unanimous decision ensuring that the artificial gods would remain loyal to them. Because of that, before any people obtained ancient god-level power, their genetic code was changed. As long as the master controlling their life wanted to kill them, they would die from a single thought. After so many years, only a few existences had been able to change their own genetic code once more. Sleipnir flung its head to the side. "Lord, your distinguished self is certainly joking. If not for the genetic code in our bodies, how could those people which disgust us act as the hegemons of this world for so long?" "Humph! Hegemons!" The system snorted and disdainfully cursed, "Are they even suitable?" After saying that, the system changed the topic and gloomily said, "Sleipnir, I can accept your request, but I want you to pledge that if there really comes a day when the great battle spoken about in the prophecy occurs, that you and your master will stand on our side. This is our duty." Sleipnir lowered its head to express its loyalty. "Stay here for the time being, all right. There's branch of Underworld serpent near the Whale City. Although I don't know how many ancient gods are slumbering under this city, those people won't dare to act recklessly here." A stream of data flashed through Li Yunmu's eyes, and after a long time system added, "Given my understanding of those people, they will dispatch a secret group to obliterate us. Their leader should be Odin." Li Yunmu then inquired directly in his mind, "You speak so confidently, what happens if you can't free him from control when the time comes? Wouldn't it be embarrassing for everyone? Moreover, even if you undid his restriction." Li Yunmu's last words were clearly aimed at Sleipnir. He could see that each and every one of the artificial gods was proud and arrogant. They weren't willing to serve anyone. So if Sleipnir hadn't needed the system's help, it might have already dealt with Li Yunmu. Even if Sleipnir had a little bit of benevolence in its heart and didn't want to kill Li Yunmu, it would still have thrown him away and left long ago without saying anything. Sleipnir defected. A figure clad in knight armor prevalent in Europe before the Dark Age slowly crossed his arms in front of his chest. The person known as King Lan wore a black gown at that moment, and he respectfully said, "That's right, respectful regimental commander. According to the data detected by us, Sleipnir had already renounced its past glory and thrown itself into the darkness." Regimental commander remained silent for a while, then slowly said in a deep and resounding voice, "What about Odin? His mount betrayed us, so ask him to take action and behead the traitor. It will serve as proof that he also hadn't betrayed his past glory." "Yes, Sir Regimental Commander." Behind his dark mantle, King Lan raised the corners of his mouth. "I will immediately go and arrange it." Chapter 610, He is not my god. That genetic code was personally designed by me, which is why I dared to be certain back then that no one among the survivors would be able to break it. But as time passed, perhaps my secret genetic code had indeed been broken by someone already. But I'm certain that even if someone did break my secret genetic code, they didn't make it public. Otherwise, you youngster would have perished a moment ago, since then it would have been impossible for me to control Sleipnir. The system grew pensive after those words thought. Yet your words are also reasonable, youngster. The secret genetic code is only a guarantee. As long as the artificial gods don't betray humanity, their actions and thoughts are their own. In other words, it cannot be ruled out that some of the gods may already be colluding with the ambitious guys. Li Yunmu ridiculed with a sneer. He wasn't fond of gambling and didn't want to gamble on whether Odin would stand on their side or not. If the gamble was won, he would only gain the assistance of two ancient god-level existences, while if he lost, he couldn't bear the price of it. If Sleipnir hadn't been present, Li Yunmu would have been willing to flee into a forest and hide himself thoroughly. He would have changed his face and cultivated in the origin world under a new identity until he was able to confront the ambitious guys. The ancient gods and even the ambitious humans were definitely unable to get a precise idea of who he was. At most, they could sense when the system used its abilities, so every time they took action, it was based on the last response received. In a worst-case scenario, Li Yunmu could endure patiently for a time being and not use the system's assistance. Mortal, you don't understand my master's arrogance. He absolutely won't. Sleipnir hadn't finished speaking, when its complexion changed. How could my master's spirit soldier exist nearby? Don't tell me no, that cannot be. Spirit soldier was not an unfamiliar phrase to Li Yunmu since he had gone through the information provided by the system. He also roughly understood what sort of existence was Sleipnir's master Odin. He was the king of many gods of Asgard who had attempted to resist fate. Naturally, God Odin was also quite cruel. In order to resist the imminent dusk of his life, he caused the deaths of countless soldiers on the battlefield and broke apart countless families. He dispatched valkyries to guide the souls of the dead and turned them into spirit soldiers. The existence of a spirit soldier in the vicinity wasn't good news for Li Yunmu. Each of them had profound battle experience and strength, and they formed the last line of defense for Scandinavia. After a moment, a squad of about 13 people slowly appeared in Li Yunmu's line of sight. Brunhilde. When Sleipnir, who was standing by Li Yunmu's side, looked at the woman standing at the front of the squad, alarm appeared in its eyes. Li Yunmu tilted his head and sized up the group in front of his eyes. Brunhilde had silver hair and was wearing a black skirt and a green cloak. Apart from her, all others were wearing identical silver battle armor and had extremely illusory blue energy wings behind their backs. Although the spirit soldiers wore standard armor, Li Yunmu didn't dare to underestimate them. After all, based on the information provided by the system, Brunhilde was Odin's famous valkyrie. The soldiers personally led by the woman related to God King, how could they be underestimated? A group of spirit soldiers and nothing more. I am afraid Underworld Serpent's people won't care much about it. Even if Odin himself appeared, it wouldn't be enough for Underworld Serpent to awaken the ancient gods hibernating under the city. That group of ambitious guys is also the same. Otherwise, if both sides didn't agree with the other party stepping into their territory, the origin world would have turned upside down a long time ago. The system's tone turned quite grave, and it slowly stated, Odin's very intelligent. Although he likes war, he is the most outstanding at strategy. He should be afraid that like how I controlled Sleipnir, I would also control him, so he didn't dare to appear personally. Li Yunmu touched his nose and smiled slightly. You mean that only after I obliterate this Brunhilde and those 12 spirit soldiers to ashes that I will get to meet Odin? Mortal, mind your tone. Sleipnir coldly looked at Li Yunmu. That is God King's daughter, the princess of our country. Pfft. Li Yunmu disdainfully smiled, and the next instant, a cyan divine blade appeared in his hand. His whole body turned into a flux energy arrow and shot forward. One spirit soldier stepped forward and struck down with the heavy sword in his hand. He didn't pay any attention to the fact that Li Yunmu would harm him and only seemed to want to kill his enemy. This was all that was on his mind. With such actions, the so-called spirit soldiers should not be called soldiers, but puppets. Li Yunmu burst forth with his full strength, and in the blink of an eye, he reached the spirit soldier's side. The next instant, the spirit soldier's arm which held the sword was separated from his body. But this wasn't the end of him. The instant the spirit soldier's enormous sword's edge touched the ground, a milky white halo spread out from it. Without enough time to evade, Li Yunmu's head was instantly enveloped by it. What joke is this? Li Yunmu thought of something, and he was about to move, but he was immediately stopped by the milky white halo. Brunhilde, whose head was covered in silver hair, coldly looked at Li Yunmu. "Brute," she said in an evaluating tone of voice. Before she was even finished though, the cyan divine blade in Li Yunmu's hand turned into a crescent blade with which he ruthlessly smashed at the halo. Terrifying power congealed at one point, and the power of 7,000 oxen power burst forth. Milky white halo swayed, and one after another, black dots appeared on it. But it still didn't explode into pieces, which caught Li Yunmu off guard. Apparently astonished by the strength of his strike, Brunhilde looked at Li Yunmu and said in a profound tone, "Boorish fellow who only has brute force in his mind, you will stop here. Wait until my god comes, remember. Your god is your god, I don't care about him." Li Yunmu bellowed furiously. 21 shadows and the main body unleashed their strength simultaneously, and another strike ruthlessly struck the halo. "That guy is your god, but not my god. His father wants to see him, so get lost and call him here," he roared at the same time. As the final word disappeared into the air, the cyan divine blade in Li Yunmu's hand cracked the edge of the halo, and suddenly, the heavens themselves seemed to have lost their splendor.